In a world still priced in dollars, few noticed when 96% of Russia-India trade quietly abandoned it. But in geopolitics, earthquakes rarely make noise. What appears as a routine state visit, barely acknowledged by Western media, may, in reality, mark one of the most consequential financial shifts of the decade. It unfolded without fanfare, without political theater, and without the ideological packaging that usually accompanies global turning points. Yet the implications are difficult to ignore. To understand why this matters, one must look beneath the surface. International systems are not transformed by declarations, they are transformed by behavior. When two major economies begin conducting nearly all mutual settlements in national currencies, they are not simply adjusting their payment preferences. They are signaling that the existing financial order may no longer offer the security, neutrality, or predictability it once claimed. What happened in New Delhi is therefore more than diplomacy. It is a quiet recalibration of trust. The roots of this moment stretch back a decade. Crimea in 2014 marked the beginning of a sanctions architecture that fundamentally altered Moscow's strategic orientation. Minsk I revealed an unresolved European security crisis long before 2022. And the sweeping freeze of Russian sovereign assets shook the principle of sovereign immunity, an event that reverberated not only in Moscow, but across capitals of the global south. Few countries understood this shift as clearly as India, a state that has historically navigated great power rivalry with caution rather than allegiance. Seen through this lens, the Putin-Modi meeting becomes a chapter in a larger transition, subtle in tone but structural in consequence. If global realignments are happening in silence, perhaps the real question is who is paying attention. Putin's return to India after a 4-year absence was not staged as a spectacle, yet it carried the weight of a geopolitical moment that few outside Eurasia seemed willing to acknowledge. The quiet nature of the visit was almost symbolic, a reminder that some of the most consequential shifts do not occur in front of cameras, but in exchanges that unfold far from the Western media cycle. For Moscow and New Delhi, the meeting was not ceremonial but strategic, reflecting a reality in which both nations are adjusting to a rapidly decomposing international order. India received Putin not as a guest seeking relevance, but as a long-standing partner whose presence fits naturally into its broader architecture of strategic autonomy. And in the silence surrounding this visit, one can sense a discomfort, an unspoken recognition that a partnership once considered peripheral is becoming structurally important to the emerging world. Since 2022, India has played a role far more consequential than many Western policymakers care to admit. While Europe and the United States focused on isolating Russia, India became the single largest stabilizer, preventing Moscow from drifting into absolute dependency on Beijing. This was not an act of defiance against the West. It was a deliberate assertion of India's doctrine. No alignments that compromise long-term sovereignty, no strategic choices made under duress. Ironically, pressure from Washington, including a sharper diplomatic posture under Trump's second administration, only reinforced New Delhi's determination to avoid being positioned as a subordinate player in a bipolar contest. It left India navigating between three power centers, leveraging tensions rather than absorbing them. And behind this balancing act lies a deeper question rarely voiced aloud. Is India resisting alignment, or is it quietly shaping the terms of a new geopolitical equilibrium? The durability of the Russia-India partnership cannot be understood without revisiting its long historical runway. Over the past 25 years, the relationship has been elevated repeatedly, culminating in their uniquely titled Special and Privileged Strategic Partnership. It is a formulation rarely used in international diplomacy, and one that reflects decades of steady, crisis-resistant cooperation. Even as global alliances fractured, Russia and India maintained a trajectory largely untouched by ideological swings or leadership transitions. This continuity, almost anomalous in today's volatile environment, is what allows the partnership to expand even under intense external pressure. It offers both nations a predictable platform at a time when predictability is becoming a scarce global commodity. And yet, beneath the warmth and symbolism, a quiet strategic reality takes shape. In a world where many partnerships are transactional and fragile, the endurance of this one may become a stabilizing element in the very system now undergoing its slow, silent redesign. Despite the political, cultural, and economic differences between them, Russia and India share one quality that has become increasingly rare in international relations: the absence of historical grievance. They have never fought a war against one another, never been locked in territorial disputes, and seldom found themselves on opposing sides of major global crises. In an era defined by mistrust, even among allies, this lack of conflict forms a strategic advantage. It creates a foundation on which cooperation can grow without the emotional baggage that burdens so many bilateral relationships. As other powers recalibrate their alliances on the basis of fear, sanctions, or ideological conformity, Moscow and New Delhi move with a steadier hand. Yet the very stability of this relationship invites a more nuanced question. Is this harmony simply a product of historical distance? Or is it evolving into a deliberate instrument in the struggle to shape the contours of a multipolar world? This calm foundation is precisely what enables India to maintain its independent course despite unrelenting geopolitical pressure. Washington hoped that energy sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the rhetoric of moral responsibility would push India into alignment with Western policy toward Moscow. Instead, India responded by deepening its strategic autonomy, purchasing record volumes of Russian oil, expanding defense cooperation, and refusing to sever economic ties that served its national interest. For New Delhi, sovereignty is not an abstract principle. It is a generational posture shaped by decades of navigating great power rivalry without becoming a dependent actor within it. Even the threat of secondary sanctions or the political signaling embedded in U.S. legislation such as CAATSA did little to alter India's trajectory. Rather, they reinforce the perception that alignment with any one superpower is inherently unstable. And so India's position becomes clearer. It will not be coerced, not by Washington, not by Beijing, and not by Moscow. Yet this assertiveness carries its own strategic tension. Can the pursuit of absolute autonomy endure in a world where economic and security frameworks are becoming increasingly weaponized? Against this backdrop, the choreography of Putin's meetings in New Delhi took on a significance far greater than the formal protocol suggests. The informal discussion on December 4, followed by extended negotiations at Hyderabad House the next day, illustrated a partnership operating with ease and depth. Even the meeting with President Draupadi Murmu underscored the full-state character of the visit, a signal that India was not attempting to downplay the engagement to appease Western sensitivities. The length and tone of the talks revealed a shared understanding that the international system is shifting in ways that require long-term coordination rather than episodic dialogue. While photographs captured warmth and ceremonial grace, the real substance lay in the unspoken message. Both nations see turbulence ahead, and both intend to shape rather than endure the world that emerges from it. What remains uncertain is whether the silence surrounding this visit reflects analytical oversight in the West or an unwillingness to confront how quickly the global center of gravity is moving beyond its traditional boundaries. The substance of the visit emerged most clearly in the economic agenda laid out through 2030, a roadmap that signaled not only commercial ambition, but a structural shift in how both nations intend to navigate the global financial system. The target of reaching $100 billion in bilateral trade would be notable on its own, yet it is the mechanism of that trade that carries far greater geopolitical weight. Today, 96% of Russia-India settlements take place in national currencies, a figure that would have been unthinkable before the sweeping Western sanctions and asset freezes of the past decade. The decision by the United States and Europe to immobilize Russian sovereign reserves, once described as a necessary punitive measure, inadvertently pushed many countries to question the reliability of Western custodial systems such as Euroclear. The erosion of sovereign immunity, something the global financial architecture was built upon, did not go unnoticed in New Delhi, Brasilia, Riyadh, or Pretoria. For BRICS members, the Russia-India settlement model has quietly become a case study in how large economies can gradually step outside the dollar-centric framework without announcing any formal opposition to it. And yet, the deeper question persists. Is de-dollarization now a strategic vision or merely a reaction to a system that has proven itself capable of being weaponized? Momentum carried into the discussion of a potential free trade zone between India and the Eurasian Economic Union, an idea that would have seemed peripheral a decade ago but is now aligned with a broader effort to diversify supply chains away from Western-dependent corridors. Moscow framed the initiative as a gateway to expanded commercial integration across Eurasia. New Delhi viewed it as a pragmatic hedge that allows it to maintain access to multiple economic spheres without committing to any singular bloc. Energy cooperation, meanwhile, remained central. Russia's assurance of uninterrupted and competitively priced supplies reinforced India's strategy of insulating itself from volatility in global markets, a volatility amplified by sanctions regimes that often punish importers as much as producers. In this context, the India-Russia energy relationship becomes less about barrels and discounts and more about geopolitical predictability. But predictability is not the same as permanence, and India must continually assess whether deepening energy ties with Moscow might, over time, narrow its maneuvering space as Washington and Beijing intensify their strategic rivalry. The question is not whether the partnership is beneficial, it clearly is, but how long such a delicate balance can hold. Beyond the macroeconomics and energy flows, the visit also opened an unexpected frontier of cooperation: pharmaceuticals. India's position as a global leader in vaccine production, generics, and oncology drugs gives it an influence that extends well beyond the global south. The announcement of a major joint pharmaceutical plant in Russia's Kuga region represents more than foreign investment. It is the beginning of a supply chain architecture intentionally built outside the orbit of Western pharmaceutical giants. For Moscow, it offers the dual benefit of industrial diversification and reduced reliance on Western medical imports, an area increasingly sensitive under sanctions. For India, it opens a vast market at a time when its pharmaceutical industry is seeking to expand beyond price-competitive exports into higher-value research partnerships. This initiative, though framed as a commercial project, fits into a larger strategic pattern: two nations constructing parallel avenues of development in anticipation of a world divided not by ideology, but by incompatible regulatory and financial systems. And yet, this evolution invites another subtle question: whether the emergence of alternative supply chains represents genuine resilience, or merely the early contours of a fragmented global economy whose fault lines no longer run neatly between East and West, but between systems of trust and coercion. The economic dimension of the visit broadened even further, with Russia's largest bank, Sber, announcing plans to significantly expand its presence in India. On the surface, this appears to be a routine financial development. Yet it unfolds at a moment when the global banking system is increasingly pulled into geopolitical disputes. For Indian institutions, deeper engagement with Russian banks carries the practical benefit of smoothing non-dollar trade, but it also introduces the latent risk of secondary sanctions from Washington, an instrument that has reshaped countless financial relationships across the global South. New Delhi understands that proximity to sanctioned entities can trigger scrutiny regardless of intent. Still, it also recognizes that overdependence on Western-controlled financial rails is no longer sustainable in an era where access can be abruptly politicized. The parallel discussion of a potential 30-day visa-free regime for tourists, an unusual step between two non-Western powers, reinforces this trajectory. Russia and India are not simply expanding trade. They are building connective tissue across finance, mobility, and people-to-people exchange. These small mechanisms accumulate into something larger, the gradual construction of an ecosystem that can function even when the traditional global system becomes unstable. The launch of RT India stood out as a different but equally consequential pillar of the visit. Information has become one of the defining battlegrounds of the emerging multipolar world, and Moscow's decision to create a dedicated media presence for Indian audiences signals an awareness that geopolitical influence is no longer measured solely in trade flows or military cooperation. For Russia, RT India offers a channel to present narratives that diverge from Western media framing, particularly on issues such as sanctions, global governance, and the shifting balance of power. For India, the platform is a reminder that it has become a coveted audience in the global competition for informational legitimacy. Yet, beyond the symbolic value, the move underscores a deeper reality. The Global South is no longer a passive consumer of great power narratives, but a contested domain where influence must be earned, not assumed. As academic exchanges, scientific collaboration, and student mobility between the two countries continue to rise, these informational ties become part of a broader architecture of soft power that shapes how publics perceive the rapidly changing international environment. India's posture on Ukraine, reaffirmed during the visit, reflected a consistency that contrasts sharply with the polarized expectations of major powers. New Delhi reiterated its call for a long-term political settlement, a position often misinterpreted as neutrality but more accurately described as strategic patience. Unlike many Western observers, India views the war not as an isolated rupture of 2022, but as the culmination of a crisis rooted in the failure of Minsk I and II to establish a durable security framework. This long-range perspective shapes India's caution toward maximalist narratives on both sides. It understands that a sustainable peace cannot be engineered through punishment alone, nor can it emerge from a world divided into rigid blocks. For this reason, India positions itself as a quiet potential mediator, not by offering plans or initiatives, but by maintaining credibility with all parties involved. Its refusal to condemn Moscow in absolute terms is not an endorsement. It is a recognition that bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt in a moment of global turbulence. There is, however, an underlying strategic question. As the war reshapes European security and redraws alliances, can India remain a detached observer? Or will the gravitational pull of global polarization eventually require choices it has long sought to avoid? The answer may define India's role in the next chapter of the international order. The broader context surrounding the visit becomes clearer when set against the backdrop of an international order that is no longer merely strained but quietly fracturing. The so-called liberal world order had long depended on a perception of neutrality, particularly within its financial and legal institutions. That perception began to erode in 2014, and it collapsed further in 2022 when Russian sovereign assets were immobilized across Western jurisdictions. What was once considered an inviolable principle, sovereign immunity, suddenly proved conditional. New Delhi, like many capitals across the global south, interpreted this not only as a punitive measure against Moscow, but as a precedent that could one day be applied to any state whose policies diverged from Western expectations. In conversations across ministries and central banks, the same question surfaced. If reserves are no longer sacrosanct, what anchor remains for global financial trust? It is within this climate of uncertainty that Russia and India's quiet economic realignment acquires its strategic depth. De-dollarization, once an abstract geopolitical theory, is gradually becoming a practical safeguard for nations seeking to reduce exposure to a system capable of redefining the rules at moments of political necessity. Yet, even as new structures take shape, an uneasy truth lingers beneath them. A world with fewer shared rules may be more equitable, but it is also far less predictable. It is in this atmosphere of shifting fault lines that analysts revisit an idea once thought to belong to the archives of the Cold War, the non-alignment movement. And yet, what is emerging today between Moscow and New Delhi is not a nostalgic revival, but a modern reinterpretation shaped by vastly different realities. India's contemporary strategy is not about avoiding great power rivalry as it was in the mid-20th century, but about preventing that rivalry from dictating its choices. Russia, for its part, seeks partners that allow it to diversify away from over-reliance on China without entering any formal alliance that constrains its autonomy. BRICS expansion in 2024 further reinforced this logic, demonstrating that a growing number of states no longer view alignment with the West as the default path to security or development. Instead, they seek flexible partnerships that prioritize sovereignty over ideology. The Russia-India dynamic fits seamlessly into this pattern, two nations constructing parallel avenues of cooperation without demanding exclusivity from each other. Still, the strategic ambiguity inherent in this model raises a subtle but important question. Can a world built on many centers of power maintain coherence? Or will it eventually splinter into rival spheres defined less by ideology and more by incompatible systems of finance, technology, and law? As Russia and India deepen their partnership, the effects extend far beyond their bilateral sphere and into the broader regions connected to them. What began as a set of pragmatic economic arrangements now functions as a template for mid-sized and emerging states seeking alternatives to Western-centric supply chains. Energy security, pharmaceutical cooperation, and localized financial settlements create ripple effects that reach from Southeast Asia to the Gulf and across Africa. Countries that once viewed integration through Western institutions as the only viable pathway now observe Moscow and New Delhi crafting a development model that prioritizes resilience over dependence. The logic is straightforward but powerful. If two large economies can reduce their vulnerability to external shocks through diversified systems, smaller economies may follow. India's vision of a global South partnership finds quiet reinforcement in these developments as regional actors begin exploring their own strategies to avoid entanglement in the US-China rivalry. Yet, even in this atmosphere of optimism, the underlying challenge remains. Can these emerging networks generate enough stability to offset the fragmentation of the old order? Or will the proliferation of parallel systems create new uncertainties for states already operating on the margins of global power? What ultimately emerges from this partnership is a convergence of interests that extends far beyond the immediate political moment. For Russia, deepening ties with India provide a crucial counterweight to the gravitational pull of China and asymmetry Moscow is eager to manage as it recalibrates its geopolitical posture under prolonged Western sanctions. For India, cooperation with Russia helps maintain a diversified strategic portfolio, ensuring that no single power, neither the United States nor China, can dominate its long-term security architecture. This dual pursuit of autonomy forms the backbone of their evolving relationship, giving both sides the flexibility to maneuver within an increasingly polarized environment. Yet, multipolarity, despite its appealing rhetoric, is not inherently stable. It offers room for independent action, but also disperses responsibility across actors whose interests may converge one day and diverge sharply the next. As Russia and India position themselves within this unfolding structure, they may discover that shaping a new order is far easier than sustaining one. The question that hangs quietly over their cooperation is whether the world they are helping to build will prove more resilient than the one they believe is fading, or simply more complex. This strategic reorientation carries implications far beyond Moscow and New Delhi, particularly for Washington. For years, the United States operated under the assumption that India's long-term trajectory would naturally align with Western interests, especially in balancing China. The evolving Russia-India partnership challenges that assumption. New Delhi's willingness to preserve close ties with Moscow, even in moments of intense Western pressure, signals that India is not a junior partner in any global framework, but an autonomous actor with its own calculus. If Washington reassesses its approach, it may discover an opportunity rather than a threat. India's relationships with both Russia and the West could serve as a stabilizing bridge in a fragmented global environment. But that possibility requires a degree of strategic humility rarely displayed in U.S. foreign policy, particularly toward the global South. Many nations are watching how Washington responds to India's choices, evaluating whether the United States will adapt to a multipolar world or continue to insist on a hierarchy that fewer states are willing to accept. Ultimately, India's message is subtle but unmistakable. Partnership is possible, but not at the expense of sovereignty. As the visit drew to a close, the mood surrounding it remained warm, measured, and unmistakably intentional. There was no triumphalism, no grand proclamations, only the quiet confidence of two nations secure in the trajectory they are building. The agreements signed may appear technical, but their cumulative effect is profound. They hint at the early architecture of a global system no longer anchored exclusively in Western institutions or Western norms. For Russia and India, this moment marks not the culmination of a strategy, but the beginning of a new phase in which economic cooperation, energy security, technological collaboration, and diplomatic flexibility converge into a coherent long-term vision. And yet, even as the partnership strengthens, a sense of uncertainty lingers at the edges. The world is shifting, but its destination remains unclear. Multipolarity promises many centers of power, many voices, and many paths to development, but it also presents the risk of fragmentation, contested norms, and unpredictable alliances. In this landscape, Moscow and New Delhi may find both opportunity and vulnerability intertwined. What is certain, however, is that their cooperation now carries meaning far beyond bilateral interests. It is one of the quiet signals shaping the next iteration of the global order. In the end, the significance of this visit lies not in the ceremonies or announcements, but in the deeper currents it reveals. Russia and India are not simply expanding commerce or reaffirming diplomatic ties. They are navigating a world in which the old certainties no longer hold. The foundations of the previous order, financial neutrality, predictable alliances, and stable geopolitical alignments have begun to shift, slowly at first and now more visibly with each passing year. The de-dollarization of bilateral trade, the construction of parallel supply chains, and the quiet reassertion of sovereign decision-making are all symptoms of a broader transformation. They suggest that the mechanisms which once underpinned global trust are weakening, replaced by a fragmented landscape in which nations rely increasingly on their own resilience rather than institutional guarantees. Yet, for all the strategic clarity gained during this visit, the future remains unresolved. The emerging multipolar system offers possibility but not assurance. It promises diversification, autonomy, and balance, but it can just as easily give way to instability if the centers of power drift too far apart. Russia and India stand at a crossroads of opportunity, shaping alternatives in a world that is shedding its old architecture, but they cannot escape the uncertainty that accompanies every structural transition. The next chapter of the story will depend not only on what these nations build, but on how the rest of the world responds to the quiet reconfiguration taking place beneath the noise of daily politics. If global realignments are happening in silence, perhaps the real question is who is paying attention,